Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
We continue the journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights, LLC, and it is in memory and the schus of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav HaShalom and Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav HaShalom. It is also in the merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz, Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis, for many long, healthy years. And special dedication to Achenu V'Achesenu, to our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. May God protect them and keep them well, and in the way that we should have total peace, but peace al pitera, shleimus ha'aretz, in a full and a complete peace that will ultimately lead the Karev to the Gula Hamitis V'Ashlema. So we finished the first Perek of Tanya, the first chapter in Tanya, and we discussed that there are two nefoshes, there are two souls within every Jew. The first one is called the Nefesh Habamis, though he didn't give it the name yet, but he said it's the soul that's rooted in the Klippas Nega. As we had explained, it's rooted in a concealed state of the divine that has like a husk, as an example, a husk, a peel, a shell that conceals the fruit within. So this Nefesh, called the biological soul, or the soul that enlivens and gives us physical life, that is called the first soul. From there is rooted the negative characteristics of a human being, but also positive ones, as we learned. Now we go to the second Perek in Tanya, and he was going to begin with Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael, the second soul within Yisrael, within a Jew, which is going to be called the Nefesh Alekis, the divine soul. Before we learn inside, let me just preface. Remember, we're talking about souls here. And this, I'm mentioning it very, very deliberately, because we human beings in general are not trained to think in ethereal terms. We think about things in very tangible terms. If someone were to ask you about space and time, we define it. Space means the room you're sitting in, the seat you're sitting in, the city, the country, the place you're at. Time, right now, is Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, time 10 o'clock in the evening, Eastern time. But when you talk about things like nefoshes, a nefesh, it doesn't quite limit itself to the confines and the parameters that we're used to thinking in terms of. So if someone said to you, where's your body? Right here. You look in the mirror, you see a body. You see other bodies. If someone says, where's your soul? The answer is the soul is within you, but is it occupying within you? If you opened up, God forbid, the body, would you find a soul? You'd find a heart, you'd find lungs, you'd find other organs. So when you talk about a soul, we have to keep that in mind, not to apply anthropomorphic and other physical expressions, because you're dealing with something that is of a divine character. The truth is, even the animal soul is not a physical soul. It relates to physicality and it energizes it. But especially the divine soul that we're going to be discussing. So then how do we speak about it in ways that we can make sense? So there's Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in our language. If the Torah spoke only in spiritual language, none of us, or most of us at least, would not be able to really relate to it. Think of it almost like a moshel, an example. But not an example of a foreign idea. It's an example that you're explaining an idea to a student, that the student can understand it in his or her terms. It's vital to keep that in mind in general when you learn Chassidus, Pnimius HaTorah, Nishmasa Daraisa, the Neshama. That Neshama, though it exists, but it exists and we need to relate to it with different instruments. You can't relate to it and try to define it by the usual sensory and empirical the tools that we have. Because those tools work for physicality. When you're dealing with spiritual, you have to think in spiritual terms. This is always important to keep in mind, but especially as we're going to be learning the next few lines in Tanya, this next chapter in Tanya, and in general, to keep in mind that idea of spiritual language, ruchnius, if you wish, ethereal, And in that sense, we have two nefashos within us. If someone says, well, where can I find them? You're not going to find them with a microscope. You're not going to find them with an X-ray. You're not going to find them by observation. They speak to you. They speak to you and influence you. As we shall be discussing, the animal soul, as we discussed, influences us essentially in an egocentric way, because its focus is on the shell. Now, that doesn't mean it's doomed, God forbid. It means it needs work, which is, of course, Avodas Ha'adam, which is the work we do to reveal the fruit within the shell. But on its natural scale, when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you feel is your own body. You're hungry, you're thirsty, you're tired. We have physical sensations. Then you begin to think about and say, Moida'ani, I have a neshama within me, which of course we'll talk about as being the neshama, the nefesh halikis, the divine. But that's what comes natural to us. So you see it through its effect on us, not necessarily through physical eyes or or hear it with your ears. It's not through sight, sound, touch, and smell. And the same thing with the nefesh halikis. We see it through its effect on us. And it's there. And the best proof is that when a person, for example, chooses, instead of being selfish, to be selfless, that you have two choices before you. One is to help someone, one is to just take care of yourself. If you make that choice, that's the nefesh halikis at work. As, of course, we'll be discussing at length in Tanya in the next chapters. The reason I preface it, because he's going to be using language, the Alter Rebbe now, in explaining this nefesh halikis, this nefesh shenis. And the language, some people immediately, when you hear it, it sounds a little like very physical. Like we're going to learn the word chelik, that the nefesh is a piece of the divine. So two things need to be pointed out here. That number one, everything written in Tanya is not a chidush of the Alter Rebbe. There's chidushim of the Alter Rebbe, many of his interpretations. But the basic principles are all from sources before, as he said, mi pi sofrim, mi pi seifrim, and he cites them. Even this very concept of two nefashos comes from the Shari Kedusha of Reb Chaim Vital, as the Alter Rebbe cited. And you see how copious his notes are and his grounding, which in general is the derech HaTorah. The way of Torah, you always cite sources. You don't just say things. Everything's with a source. But especially when you're dealing with more abstract matters and matters that people are not so familiar with, it's even more important to have the sources to make sure everything is grounded properly, but then also interpreted properly, which is what we're going to do now. So I'm going to share the sources as well as explain what they are in the context of what we're going to be learning now. So, with that Akdama, let's begin Perek Beis. We're going to learn inside Perek Beis, second chapter of Tanya. V'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. After talking about the first soul, the animal soul, the soul that's rooted in Klipas Nega, which means a soul that's impacted by the shell and by the layers and by the shrouds, if you wish, that conceal the divine. This nefesh, by contrast, he says, Hichelik elekam mimal mamish. The second soul in the Jew is a piece of God above. Now this is a verse that comes from Iyuv, the book of Job. Iyuv, Lamed Aleph Beis 31:2. With the addition of the word mamish, which we'll explain afterwards. Now when you look in Iyuv, the pasuk, the literal meaning of the pasuk doesn't have anything to do with telling us what a neshama is like. Iyuv is talking about his own personal life, and that his personal life is chelik, meaning his geidel, his lot, so to speak, was from God. And yet he's suffering. So that's what Iyuv is talking about. And yet, the Alter Rebbe, but not that Alter Rebbe is not the first, in the Kubolim, used this verse to explain the neshama, the nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. Now, which Kubolim used it that way? So I want to give you the sources. Though the Alter Rebbe does not bring here the sources, but first of all, because he's relying on Rabbi Chaim Vital, Shari Kedusha, where there he brings the idea of the second soul, but specifically the pasuk Chelik Elekam Mimal, and even with the word mamish, which means literal, the sources are starting from Rav Moshe Cordovero, the great Kabbalist from Tzvas, a contemporary, a little older than the Arizal. So he writes about it in Sefer HaPardis, the beginning of Shar Lamed Beis, section or gate 32. Reishis Chochma, who's a Talmud of the Ramak, famous Reishis Chochma, is Shar Ava, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and a number of places. The Arizal himself, in Shar Ruach HaKedesh, and Likutei Torah Pasha Bereshis, Likutei Torah of the Arizal. And then, probably this is the primary place because it's elaborated upon, there's a sefer called Shefa Tal, another student of the Ramak. His name was the Mekubal Rab Shapsi Sheftel Horowitz, student of Moshe Cordovero, and he has a sefer in his introduction to Shefa Tal. He cites this verse. And at length he has another sefer. Rab Shapsi Sheftel has another sefer called Nishmas Shabti Halevi in Shar Daled and on, gate 4 and on. And as well, I'll give a few more sources. The Shalah and Beis HaChachmeh. At the end, Yeshu Levov to the Baal Mishnas Chassidim, another Talmud of the Arizal. Yariz Dvosh of the Yavitz. The Eirachaim in the beginning of Bereshis. So what you see from this is quite diverse sources, and I specifically cited them, though I don't usually do it in this shir, is because the verse is not literally meant that way. I wanted to point out how this is universal. You look at these sources, they're not all one source. They're very different type of teachers. Mukabalim, but they're all Kemuvan, Musmachim, and completely reliable and authorities. But so the Pasuk is long before Tanya. It's already been established as being a Pasuk to explain the idea. The Pasuk itself in Eve means something else literally, but that's a common in Torah. You have also the Pasuk Chelik Havayam in Pasha Hazinu, which the Alter Rebbe brings in the Geras HaTshuva, also Chelik Hashem, that the Jews are Chelik Hashem. The Alter Rebbe does not bring that here for different reasons, which we won't go into right now, but he uses the word Chelik. So Chelik Elikam Imal, literally a piece of God, and it says Mamish, literally. So of course the first obvious question is, how could you say such a thing? God, we know, is not made up of parts. It's not like I mentioned before, physicality is made up of parts. So how do you use the word Chelik? So Rab Shafti in the sefer that I just mentioned, in Nishmas Shabti Alevi, he actually elaborates at length on what that means. The word Chelik. So first of all, as I said before, we have to think in terms, not in physical terms. When you say Chelik, it means a piece. It means like a piece of. And let's explain what that means. God created all of existence. Every iota, every fiber of existence was created by God. So in a sense, everything is created. Why is the neshama, in this case, the nefesh alekis, this chelika, the nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael, why is it different? It's also, in that sense, everything is an extension of or a creation of godliness. But that's the key. Is it a creation of, or is it also a reflection of? So though everything in existence, because it's created by the Creator, reflects the Creator in some way, that's how it is. A creator is reflected in his creation. But the creation does not necessarily express the personality of the creator. So for example, if you build a home, many different rooms in this home. Some are primary and some are secondary. And what's the most important part of the home? It's not the physical parts of the home. It's the person who's going to live in the home. So when you say, I built a home for my child, I built a home for myself. So the part that it becomes the child is the primary goal, because the child is your love that you want to give that person a home. The fact that you've provided all the other things necessary, a kitchen, a dining room, a living room, a hallway, a storage room, those are also created by the same architect, but they're created as a stepping stone, as an intermediary, an emtsoi to the rein kavanah. So who is a piece of your heart or your soul? And using this example, that's the person you build the house for, whether it's for yourself or it's for a child. The other objects are also there. This is actually what the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin. The Mishnah says, why was a human being created last? In Sanhedrin, Daf Lamed Zayin. He's the crown jewel of creation. Why did God create Adam and Chava the last 6th day of creation? So there are two reasons given. The reason I want to focus on is because when you bring a special guest, first you set the table. You don't bring a guest and then set the table. First you set the table. So that Hashem, God created the table, the whole world, with all its beauty and everything necessary, and then he brings this crown jewel. So everything is a creation of God, but not everything is a reflection of God's direct intention. Some things are there as a means to something else. So when you say something is a chelik elokah, something is a part, you're saying it's actually reflecting the godliness, the godly intention, the godly personality for which he created the rest of the world. And this is true in everything in our lives. There are things that are means, there are things that is the actual reflection. For example, when a person's machshava, this is an example brought in Chassidus, a person's thought. A person's thought, as in contrast to his speech or to his action, is far more closer and far more reflective of what is going on within him. Because the thought is his own personal thought. So when a person, let's say, builds something, you build a piece of a pottery, or you build a house, as I just said. The building is also an expression of what you want, but it's your thought that is closest to reflect of who you are. So yes, every bird and every vegetable and every plant and every mineral on this earth, I'm specifically mentioning Chayet, Semeach, and Daimon, all created by God. And Hashgacha Pratis, God governs and rules every detail of their existence. But do they reflect the personality of the divine, or they're a creation of godliness? They're a creation. In that creation, they reflect something, like a piece of art reflects its artist. But then you bring the human being who's the ultimate purpose. He's here to fulfill. Why did God create the world in the first place? He didn't create it for an end in itself. There should be birds, animals, plants, and minerals. He wanted it to be elevated. We should make it into a dira b'tachtenim, transform it, to make it a home for the divine, as the Alter Rebbe will explain later in Tanya chapter 36. So therefore, when you say a neshama has in it, we call it a getliche kraft. It has the personality of godliness. And there's actually an interesting Torah that the Alter Rebbe in a sefer called Mei She'arim said to the Chassid, Rabbi Moshe Vilenkis. He spoke, what's a neshama? So the Alter Rebbe said that in Shari Tshuva, the Rabbeinu Yena writes about a soul. What's the personality of a soul? It's that it recognizes its creator. It recognizes its creator. He says it actually in Yiddish. But in neshama, he says, but I added in Tanya, he says, the Alter Rebbe says, chelik elikam mamish, by saying that who has a tzukach, who has a passion and a intimate connection with recognizing the reality of God in the deepest way, no one but a human being has that. Only a neshama has that. So neshama is like a child, as we'll soon learn, that recognizes and knows its father, its parent. The creation is aware that it has a creator and will never waver from it. Like clockwork, every part of existence will always live up to exactly what God wants it to do. The human being has actually free will. But on the other hand, the human being has an intimate connection. An intimate connection because it's a piece of the divine. Like a child is an extension of its parent. It's not just a parent, it's not just like a friend. It actually has the DNA, the very genetic matter that comes from its parents. Obviously, that's a moshel, a physical example. We're going to learn about it a little later in the beginning of this chapter 2. But the same thing, so when you talk about a child, like I mentioned before, building a home, you're not just talking about the means, you're talking about something that reflects and has the same personality as the divine, and can therefore educate and illuminate and teach the world to appreciate the divine within everything. So there's a difference between a product, which is all of creation, and there's a difference between the producer sending an extension of the godliness, of the personality of godliness, through the neshama. And the neshama, as it travels through this world, has that ability to not just recognize that there's a God, but to actually be permeated with it and permeate everything that it meets, imbue it with the divine. That's one critical point to make. Second critical point is that when we talk about chelik, we talk about elokah, obviously we're not talking about a piece of God, we're talking about a piece of godliness. So why do we call it God? Because godliness is an extension of God. in the words of the Baal Shem Tov, etzem kishetefes b'miktsase or b'chelke at the tefes b'kule. But there's a difference in the etzem and the chelik. So as I just explained, the chelik is a reflection of the godliness, which is rooted in the God itself, chelik alika, mimal, and mamish comes to add, as in the Rab Shapsi says, mamish goes on chelik, it's mamish a chelik, but in Chassidus is brought in different sources that mamish also goes on mimal, chelik alika mimal, alika mimal. That meaning from the ruchnius and the highest levels of godliness, that it's actually a chelik. So mamish comes to add that it's a tangible chelik. That means that when you say neshama traverses in this world, you actually have godliness traveling. And you see, I'm mentioning again the word godliness. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in explaining this idea. And if you want more, as I said, look in the Sefer from Rab Shapsi at length, where he talks about this and many other questions, how we can use these terms when you're talking about the neshama and you're talking about elokus and elokah. In Shari Gedusha of Rab Chaim Vital, I should add, in the same place where he talks about that there are two nefoshes, Shari Gedusha, it's part 3, section 2. So he says, just to paraphrase, that the neshama's light, the soul's energy, arises and flows from the energy of the 10 spheres, which we're going to talk about a little later, the divine attributes. Directly from those spheres, without any intermediary, which is why it says in the Pasuk, you are children of God. Bonim atem la'Hashem Elokechem. You are children of God. Because the soul is like a child who is completely attached to his parent, from whom his being flows. The Alter Rebbe is going to elaborate about this a little later, but I just wanted to point that out because that adds that element. That in other words, when you say there's a stone, a mineral, or a vegetable, or a plant, or an animal, you don't say it comes directly from God's attributes. The attributes manifest in concealments, in many layers, in garments, and more tzimtzumim and concealments until it's rooted. So you can say fire, for example, is rooted in gvura of Atzilus, which in turn manifests in gvura of Bria, and gvura of Yitzir, gvura of Asiya. Water is rooted in chesed. But you don't say water is without any, you don't say it is chesed, you say it evolves from chesed. Whereas a neshama is a direct flow from those spheres, and those spheres are of course directly connected, the attributes, with Eibishter, as we're going to learn, that he is one with his attributes. So I just wanted to add that piece from the Shari Gedusha. So now the Alter Rebbe continues and says, how do we know this? How do we know a neshama is rooted in such a deep way? Now it's true that says the Mukabalim say it, but the same question can be asked on them. What's the source for this? Even though you're interpreting Chelik Elokah Mimal from Iyuv in this way, but how do we know? So he brings a posuk right in the beginning of Bereshis. The first time we talk about the creation of the human being, what does it say? So Alter Rebbe continues, Kamoshe Kosav, after he says Chelik Elokah Mimal Mamish, which states the personality of a neshama is basically godly, without husks and klippus, not like the first nefesh. He says, Kamoshe Kosav Vayipar Ba'apov Nishmas Chaim. That's the first right. It's a posuk. In Bereshis Beis Zayin 2:7. What does the pasuk say? So the first half of the pasuk says God took Vayikach Shem Elokim Afar. He took earth or dust from the earth. Vayipar ba'apav nishmas chaim, and he blew. Vayipar comes from the word blow. Essentially breathed into his nostrils, into this piece of clay, of this dirt that was shaped like a physical body, but it's still not alive. It's just a inanimate mineral earth. So he blew into his nostrils the breath of life. Vayipar ba'apav nishmas chaim. The Ramban, right on the pasuk, says that as in contrast to all other creation, where we don't say that. It doesn't say that when God created the animals, or prior to that, the fish, or the celestial bodies, or everything else in the mineral and plant and animal world. It doesn't say such an expression. He also gave them life. An animal has life. Even vegetation and plants have life. Even daimon has life. It's inanimate life, but it exists. So there that expression is not used. Whereas here, the first time you have the word nishmas chayim. Into his nostrils a soul of life that he blew at. And he says, that tells us, the Ramban says, that it's not coming from the elements. The ofar min adama, the body of the human being comes from the earth, ofar, from the dirt, from the earth. But the neshama comes from God's breath. It is the ruach, what he says is, nishmas chayim, the ruach elakim. So basically, it's the idea of God's breath. This is why neshama and neshima come from the same root in Hebrew. Neshama means neshima's breath, God's breath that he blew into the nostrils. Human breath, which is the source of our life, and our oxygen, is actually God's breath that he breathed into this inanimate physical earth, and that's where the neshama comes from. We also say the same expression every morning in davening. The Alter Rebbe continues, V'ata nefachta bi. V'ata nefachta bi. So what do we say? The soul, you breathed into me. Again, the word nefachta, breathed. So what do we know from this word breathe, breath? What does that tell us? So now he's going to say, the Zohar says, it says in Zohar, man de nofach, mitechia nofach. The Zohar states that when one blows, like with breath, when you blow with your breath, it blows from the innards, from the insides. Pirush mitechiyuse umipnimiyuse, meaning from the innermost depths of his being. Shetechiyus uprimis achayis shebe'adam moitzei b'nefichose b'keach. For when a person blows forcibly, with intention, deliberately and forcibly, he exhales with a deep-rooted inner energy. So, for example, when a person speaks, it doesn't require that type of energy, regular speech. And that's why you say, B'dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, the world was created with speech. Basarim Amoris Nivre'ela. That's a maimer. It doesn't say the word breath. Vayipach, nafachta, tells you it's coming from the innermost part, that God is investing in the neshama, an inner part. Again, this is a metaphor, a more reflective of the inner personality of the divine, quote unquote. So that is the proof that the chelik alikam and mal mamish, that neshama is different than any other existing entity, that it's a deeper element of godliness as expressed through that breath. We shall stop here and continue next week. If you want to ask any questions or want to listen to previous programs, please go to tanyaapplied.com. Thank you very much. A good tavoch. Everyone be healthy and well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.